human capital consequences of in utero conditions. Professor Lavy.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Enjoy this fantastic conference. The study I'm going to present today is joint work with Anelia Schlosser. She's a colleague from Tel Aviv University and a PhD student from Jerusalem at Shani. It's about the long-term consequences, cognitive consequences of in utero conditions. And the idea is to follow individuals from conception to about age 22. Let me start with some stylized facts, some evidence about micronutrient deficiencies during pregnancy in developing countries. So, three important deficiencies that are relevant for cognitions are prevalent in most of the developing countries. For example, I'll start with anemia and iron. So, a recent WHO study suggests that half of pregnant women in developing countries suffer from anemia, largely because of iron deficiency. Some other nutrients contribute to this deficiency as well, in particular in our context, folic acids, but some other vitamins as well. The health consequences of this anemia and iron deficiency are very important, especially for brain development and cognitive development at early childhood. There is also impairment in terms of physical ability, but the focus of this talk will be on brain development and cognitive development. And what's important is that during pregnancy, this deficiency is mostly important in the first trimester of gestation. So many countries, developed countries in particular, provide supplements of iron. In some of the developing countries, we see programs like that coming up, but it's not going to be helpful in terms of brain development if these supplements are provided after the first trimester. The same thing can be said about folic acid, another micronutrient that is very important for brain development. Again, we see, according to a WHO report, recent report, that many countries are suffering from deficiency in this important micronutrient. And again, the implication is very drastic and crucial for pregnant women. So we see, again, in developed countries that folic acid is provided to pregnant women. But again, the crucial thing is to provide it during the first 12 weeks of gestation. If it's provided afterwards, it's not going to prevent the bad birth outcomes due to this deficiency. The third one is iodine deficiency. According to, again, a recent WHO report, iodine deficiency is now recognized as the most common preventable cause of brain damage in the world today, with excess of 2 million at risk from 133 countries. Okay? This is another quote about the importance of this deficiency. Humans requires iodine. Sexual functioning depends critically on adequate supply of the thyroid hormone, which influences the density of neural networks established in the developing of the brain. Again, the first trimester in terms of gestation is very crucial in terms of this deficiency. So the focus of this paper is going to be what would happen if we will eliminate these three deficiencies in a population and see the outcomes in terms of cognitive development. Before I do that, when I looked at the data from India, recent available data, it wasn't a thorough search, but I found many studies from the previous decade and some more recent ones that suggest that there is in India deficiency in all these three micronutrients. For example, this one from some slum neighborhoods in New Delhi, a survey suggests that iron deficiency is almost 80%. So 4 out of 10 of 5 women are iron deficient. They suffer from anemia. 23% have iodine deficiency. That's the mothers. And similar evidence from rural areas and other studies all over India. So it's a problem that affects many developing countries, and it's kind of dramatic. So the research question that I will discuss with you today is, as I mentioned, what would be the human capital consequences of eliminating these micro deficiencies among pregnant women? Okay? The more general question is, what are the in utero environmental conditions impact on lifetime outcomes of individuals? Cognition and perhaps more general human capital outcome. Of course, the challenge is to identify the causal effect, because the conditions in utero are correlated with other background characteristics that by themselves have an impact on cognitive development. Another challenge in terms of data is how can we follow individuals from conception to adulthood. Okay? So naturally, we would like to have an experiment with randomized allocation of individuals to treatment and control, but you can see the difficulty of implementing such an experiment, particularly in terms of follow-up without much attrition in the sample. So we fall into the domain of natural experiment, and that's what I'm going to exploit and show to you in a minute. In terms of the medical literature and the economic literature, there are several studies that have addressed the impact of in utero conditions on long-term outcome of individuals. Two important episodes. The first one is well known. It's the Dutch famine during World War II, where part of the Netherlands were controlled by the Germans and led to a severe nutritional deficiency, a famine in the population of a certain area. And this study, and this one as well, two famous and well-cited studies, followed individuals, mothers and individuals that were affected in utero by this famine, and found important effect on brain development and some human capital outcome, some health development as well. And the effects were more significant and larger for women that were exposed to this famine during the first trimester of gestation. Another example in the medical literature is the impact of radiation exposure of pregnant mothers on outcomes of offsprings. Here, the critical period is usually identified as week 8 to week 25 of gestation. Okay? So it includes part of the first trimester and most of the second trimester of pregnancy. The first trimester and part of the second trimester are actually the period where the brain is developed. By week 8, the brain size is mostly complete. The brain continues to develop. The brain actually is the organ that continues to develop the longest in the human body, but the most critical period is in the first trimester and perhaps until week 25. All this evidence are not conclusive, they are suggestive, and you will see how I will define the critical period of exposure and treatment. In terms of the economic literature, we see many studies in the last decade looking at shocks to in utero environmental conditions. Most of the studies focus on negative shocks. So for example, the effect of radiation by Almond and co-authors, so the Chernobyl accident in 1988 in the Ukraine, and the study looked at the effect on students in utero at the time in southern Sweden. A nutritional shock, again, Almond and co-author, which is a China famine. So negative shocks, mother, pregnant, exposed, and then they follow and look at their children. There are some studies look at economic shocks. Banerjee and co-authors look at the effect of an agricultural productivity shock in France, the French vineyards affected, and they study long-term effect on health. They find an effect on height of kids who were in utero at the time. This is another famous study looking at food prices in Britain in the 18th century, a spike in prices, a negative income shock, and then they look at the effect on health of children in utero at the time. Some studies look at the episodes of infectious disease So Almond study about the influenza, JPE 2006, looking at long-term health outcomes of individuals where the mother was pregnant at the time. This is a more recent one looking at effect of malaria infection of mothers, pregnant mothers, and the effect on children. So all these are negative shocks that are affecting pregnant mothers for a period of time, and then they disappear. But the question is whether there is a permanent effect in the long run. Recently, this is two studies that have a positive shocks. So the first one is by Hilary Hoynes and co-authors. I think it's forthcoming at the AR now, looking at the food stamps program in the US and its income effect on families and how it affects children in utero at the time. And they find effect on obesity and high blood pressure, heart disease, etc. So actually positive income effect on reducing this negative health outcomes. Again, this study focused on in utero exposure. This is a study of migration to Sweden by Vanderberg and co-authors when they look at early childhood exposure to better condition in Sweden upon migration of the family, and they find improved outcomes at adulthood, small effects, though this very different from other studies because the exposure here is after birth. So they were born in their home country and migrated to Sweden. So our study is similar in nature to this study in terms of a migration episode, but in utero. Okay? So the transition from one environment to another is done in utero due to migration. Lastly, let me mention this study by Erica Fields, published a few years ago. It's not an experimental study. It's an observational study using differences in difference estimation. When she looks at iodine deficiency of pregnant mothers in Tanzania, some mothers were exposed to a government program that provided supplements, and they follow children in utero at the time, and they find a significant and relatively large effect on schooling attainment. Okay? So mothers that were provided with these supplements, their children had actually on average about half a year of schooling higher than those mothers that were not. Okay? So in this project, what we do is we follow individuals who migrated from a poor country in Africa, that's Ethiopia, from northern Africa, northern Ethiopia, and migrated to Israel, a developing country, in May 1991. Okay? This episode, as you will see, is called the Operation Solomon, was a very particular form of migration. It was unexpected, completed in a short time. So within 36 hours, over 15,000 Jews from Ethiopia were airlifted and taken to Israel. So it was sort of an emergency operation. The Israeli government gathered almost 99% of the Jews in Ethiopia to Addis Ababa within a short period of time. And within 36 hours, where the Israeli Air Force sort of took over the airport in Addis Ababa, controlled it for 36 hours, and within 36 hours airlifted all those Jews from Addis Ababa to Tel Aviv. The timing was affected by the progress of the rebels in Ethiopia towards the capital. They were almost taking over the country, the capital. And there was like the last minute before a new government will come in, and the Israeli government decided to take this opportunity and take out of Ethiopia all the Jews who wanted actually to move to Israel, but they were not allowed to by the government. So it was a military operation, completed very shortly, basically without any selection in terms of who moved from Ethiopia to Israel. It's basically, as I said, 99% of those who were recognized as Jews at the time in Ethiopia. So the timing of pregnancy was unrelated to the timing of the airlift to Israel. Okay? So what we'll do in this paper is we'll look at children who were in utero in Ethiopia. So pregnancy incepted for everybody in Ethiopia, and all of them were born in Israel. Okay? The only difference will be the number of weeks of gestation in the environment in Ethiopia versus in the environment in Israel. And the main difference you will see is in terms of the supplement of those basic micronutrients to pregnant mothers. Okay? So it's a sort of a natural experiment, a quasi-random experiment, and the analysis would be with the spirit of a discontinuity design, where we will look at those that pregnancy started in Ethiopia in time to be born in Israel. What are the unique features of this study beyond what I told you up to now? First of all, it's a positive event, so it's not a negative shock to conditions in utero. It's a positive shock, so it's relatively, I think it's the first one with a positive shock. We will be able to identify the impact of this treatment for different stages of pregnancy. And it has policy implications, I think, for developed and developing countries, and also for the intergenerational effects of migration. So here we see in this figure the flow of immigrants from Ethiopia to Israel. So we see two spikes, one in 1985, the end of 1984-85, and one in May 1991. So the first one is called Operation Moses, where about 6,000 Jews were airlifted from the desert of Sudan to Israel. So these are Jews who wanted to get to Israel. It was forbidden for them to leave the country. They walked through the desert of Sudan for about 10 months. And at some point, Israeli Air Force airlifted them from the desert in Sudan to Israel. So that was a few years after the Israeli government recognized that the Jews in Ethiopia are Jews, and they are allowed to immigrate to Israel according to law of return, which states that every Jew in any place in the world can come to Israel and be granted citizenship immediately. The next big episode of immigration is Operation Solomon. So this is Moses, and I will use it in a minute, and I'll describe to you how we're going to use it. This is Solomon. So that's the episode where these Jews were airlifted within 36 hours that I described to you. And so this will be the focus of our analysis. Okay? So you can see pictures here of the style of travel from Ethiopia to Israel. No seat belts, you can tell here. People were crowded into airplanes and brought to Israel, and the airplanes went back and forth. It's only 2.5 hours flight from Addis Ababa, 3 hours flight from Addis Ababa to Tel Aviv. So the airplanes went back and forth until everybody was taken out. So I stated it's a natural experiment because the event was unexpected. It was organized by the Israeli government. It was the exogenous shock was this political events in Ethiopia. It was completed in a short time. It was not self-selected in terms of who was brought to Israel. And the timing of immigration is uncorrelated with the timing of pregnancy and birth. And I will show you evidence that those mothers who were pregnant relative to the rest of the population who came at the time, and the exposure in terms of critical period trimesters of pregnancy was not correlated with any background characteristic of the families. Okay? So that's what we do in this paper. We start with a sample that include only mothers, only children who were born in Israel from June 1991 to February 1992. So it's 9-month cohorts of children born in Israel from the moment this immigration was completed until 9 months later. So the focus is to look at children who were born within this window of 9 months. Anyone born before was born in Ethiopia. Anyone born later was conceived in Israel. So we really want to focus on those conceived. The decision to get pregnant was in Ethiopia, and the conditions upon time of beginning of the pregnancy was in Ethiopia, the same for everybody. but everybody born in Israel, so the birth conditions in the hospital was in Israel. The only difference would be how many weeks of the gestation each child spent in Israel during this term. Okay? And the differences in conditions are stark. Okay? So this is the 9-month cohorts of the study. Those are born before or after. And the differences in environmental conditions, first of all, in terms of these 3 micronutrients that I described to you, no vitamin consumption, actually, according to DHS reports in Ethiopia, taken by mothers in Ethiopia, especially in these rural villages, the most underdeveloped part of Ethiopia. It's called Gundar. It's the northern part, mountain part of Ethiopia. So no iron supplement and no folic acid supplements, 2 supplements that are compulsory for pregnant mothers in Israel. So we know from a survey with these mothers that we have done recently that all of them have taken those vitamins once they arrived to Israel. I mean, the minute they discovered that they are pregnant, they started to take the supplements. This is something that they have not done in Ethiopia. The second thing is iodine deficiency. Ethiopia is severely iodine deficient, one of the worst countries in the world, okay? According to WHO reports, according to other reports and other papers, okay? And Israel has adequate level of iodine. First, because we are close to the Mediterranean, so in the air and the soil, and there is also iodized supplement provided in salt and in other ways. Okay? So these 3 things moved from severe deficiencies to practically 0 deficiencies. Okay? There are some other differences in environmental conditions, healthcare and prenatal care. So there's no monitoring of prenatal care in Ethiopia whatsoever. There is regular monitoring of pregnant mothers in Israel, so that might be a difference in environmental conditions. And there might be a difference in nutrition, although from a survey that we have done with the mothers, they have reported that the nutrition they had in Ethiopia was better than in Israel. It's more a question of the elements of nutrition that they have had in Ethiopia, which they couldn't find at the beginning of in Israel, especially the flour that they used to make the bread. And that's why they perceived that the nutrition in Israel was not adequate compared to the level in Ethiopia. But that's a subjective assessment. In terms of general condition in Israel relative to Ethiopia, you can see the differences. Calorie intake in Israel is twice the level in Ethiopia. The average mortality is much higher in Ethiopia than in Israel at the time. A mortality rate of under 5 kids is, again, a big difference. 12 in Israel for 1,000 live births, 202 in Ethiopia. A low birth weight in terms of percentage of mothers, etc. So overall, the environmental conditions in utero in Israel are much better, but I think that the main element here is the micronutrient that were provided fully to mothers versus no provision whatsoever in Ethiopia. So how do we implement this idea in terms of empirical work? We use administrative. That's an important point. Let's discuss the results. In order to confound our evidence, it will have to be differential stress by a mother that is arriving at the 10th week of pregnancy versus a mother arriving at the 15 or 20 weeks. So you must bring into bear arguments that stress level was differential by week of gestation upon arrival to Israel. Okay? So I'm not disposing that. I think one has to discuss it in terms of differential exposure. So, yes?
You showed us average differences between Ethiopia and Israel. Is there any you showed us average differences between the 2 countries. Is there any documentary evidence that these poor immigrants received the prenatal care and health monitoring that locals received?
Yeah. Naturally, this wave of immigration was a very important event of the history of the country. They came from a very poor area in Africa, and they were followed, and there's special issues of the Israeli Journal of Medicine that published papers based on studies of this population, and there are studies related to pregnancy and prenatal care, etc., and we have evidence on that. Yes.
Is it possible the what life was less severe for treatment in Israel?
Why don't we hold questions about interpretation and questioning about the result until I'll show you the results, okay? So another strength of this study is that we use administrative data, so there is no attrition. We have access to administrative records for every individual from birth to age 20. So we have data on birth weight of each child for all those born in Israel. We have full records of their academic performance in school, their progress from one stage to another. And we have full records of their testings in what we call the matriculation program in Israel. So it's like the French baccalaureate, or in Germany or in Italy, similar programs where kids are tested in high school in high-stakes exams. The same thing in Israel. So we have all the records of all the tests every child has taken from 10th grade to 12th grade, and his scores in every exam, and we will use this. Some of it are very important in our context because, for example, whether you study math at the highest level in Israel is highly, highly correlated with IQ. We don't have data on IQ, but we have data on this math achievements, and would be very important to see not only the effect on attainment by the end of 12th grade, but also effect on quality of schooling and on outcomes that are highly correlated with innate ability. So we use this access to administrative data to look at the outcome of interest. So some background characteristics. Here I divide the sample into three parts: the first trimester, second trimester, and third trimester of pregnancy upon arrival to Israel. Okay? So you see that the mother age is about 30. That the age gap between the father and the mother is about 10.5 to 11 years. The birth order of the child is about 2.7. Average fertility, so family size about 5 kids per family. So it's a relatively high fertility population. We have now exploiting this large family size to do within family analysis where we compare siblings. So one sibling was treated and the other one was not treated. I won't show you evidence on that, but we are doing it now. It is a very low educated population. Father years of schooling is just over 2. Mother years of schooling is about the same. So it's really very low educated families. They came from Gundar. There's no formal schooling, no modern type of schooling. The means for the Israeli population at the time for this cohort was about 12.5 years of schooling. So post-high school education on average for the population in Israel. Okay? Even though the means are low, you will see some variation in terms of treatment effects by parental education. So there's 2 ways to define the critical period of pregnancy. One is to follow the literature based on the Dutch famine and to think about the first trimester as the critical period. So distinguishing mothers that arrived at the first trimester versus second and third. Okay? There is medical literature about the brain development. These are mostly theoretical with some suggestive evidence, not causal. This is some causal analysis that confirm that exposure to severe famine, severe nutritional deficiency had large effects for mothers that were pregnant in their first trimester. So we will define treatment first by trimesters of gestation upon arrival to Israel. Then we will follow also the definition that found in studies that looked at radiation exposure, and we will define the first period as week 1 to 7 of gestation, the second one 8 to 25, and the third one 26 plus. Okay? There's much overlap between the trimester definition of exposure and this radiation definition, and you'll see the effects are very, very similar. Okay? So I will present to you mainly the effect on by trimesters of exposure, and in the paper you can find detailed results by weeks of gestation. So these are some balancing tests. As you can